Hey, welcome back, A-Push Kids. We're here with our next lecture in AP US History. We're going to be covering today topic 3.10, Shaping a New Republic, all about the presidency of George Washington. Today is going to be part 2 of that lecture. George Washington is so important we can't cover him in just one 15-minute span. We're still on the same 2 learning objectives from last time, 3K and 3L. First, explain how and why competition intensified conflicts among peoples and nations between 1754 and 1800, and 3L, explain how and why political ideas, institutions, and party systems developed and changed in the new republic. So we covered key ideas 1 and 2 last time, all about how George Washington's presidency established not only new precedents, but also developed new institutions. And we also discussed how the first political parties were formed, the Federalist Party under Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. Today, we're going to cover a lot more ground. We're going to be covering key ideas 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Though they are not as large in scale, they are certainly no less important. So let's jump into it. Key idea number 3 says, war between France and Britain resulting from the French Revolution presented challenges to the United States over issues of free trade and foreign policy and fostered political disagreements. So most of this is going to happen during Washington's second term. So Washington spends much of his first term just getting the government up and running, passing things like the Judiciary Act, getting the cabinet off the ground, dealing with the Whiskey Rebellion, though that'll be in 94. I mean, Hamilton's financial, there's so much going on setting up the government. Now what he's doing is now he's got some more governance that he needs to do, and a lot of it's going to be taken up by these foreign policy concerns, dealing with foreign nations. So he has serious problems in his second term that faced the young nation. And he looks older in his picture too. I mean, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, it looks like he's aged. And he has. The presidency has worn on him. He looks older. He feels older. Though still, no one votes against him. He still gets 100% of the vote in the 1792 election. No one even bothers to go against him. But probably the biggest kind of thorn in his side is what happens in 1793. War is going to break out between Britain and France after the French Revolution. So they're going to fight again. Now, France is really what they're going to try and do is they're going to try and gain an American alliance in their war with Britain. And this really makes sense, right? Because we had fought during the American Revolution, we had fought in the hopes that France would join us, and they did after the Battle of Saratoga. And, it's time for us to repay our debts. And there's certainly people that want us to. Like Jefferson is going to want the United States to support France to fight for their liberty. On the other hand, Hamilton wants us to support Britain, specifically to avoid making our largest trade partner angry. And these two guys go back and forth. Remember, they're both in the cabinet. They're both part of this advisory board to George Washington. And if fans of the musical Hamilton, this is the subject of one of those rap battles that these guys have. Washington now, though, he comes out and he sides really with Hamilton for the most part. Because what he comes up with is he comes up with a very important foreign policy precedent. That means that future presidents are going to follow this as an example. And this is the proclamation of neutrality. Reason why is Washington believes that America was too young. We're too small. We're not powerful enough. We're not strong enough to really get ourselves involved in a European war. And this is going to be a major precedent for the United States, all the way from 1793 to 1898. However, this won't be the only foreign policy concerns that Washington is going to be worried about, which leads us to key ideas 4 and 5. 4 says the U.S. government forged diplomatic initiatives aimed at dealing with the continued British and Spanish presence in North America as U.S. settlers migrated beyond the Appalachians and sought free navigation in the Mississippi. And 5 says the Spanish, supported by the bonded labor of local American Indians, expanded their mission system into California. These provided opportunities for social mobility among soldiers and led to new cultural blending. That's the intermarriage between different groups. So what's happening with the United States is that we're growing. We didn't stop growing. In fact, the United States is growing incredibly quickly at this particular time. In fact, the United States, every 25 years, our population right now is doubling. And many of them are now spilling across the Appalachian Mountains now that the war with England is over with. We don't have any proclamation lines, and we're moving over that way. And access to the Mississippi River is significant because what this does for farmers is this allows them access to sell their produce and their products to distant markets. Roads didn't exist at the time, and so there's no way to get your product back over the mountains before it's spoiled. Instead, what they wanted to be able to do was be able to put it on a barge, float it down the river to the port at New Orleans, and then sell it there. The problem with all this, though, is that the British and the Spanish stood in the way of these settlers and our ability to sell these products to distant markets. So the way that they did so is they interfered with our trade. And this angered a lot of us. They interfered with our trade, for instance, in that the Spanish weren't allowing us to sell the product out of New Orleans. The British were stopping American ships on the high seas in a policy that was called British impressments. And this was really upsetting many Americans at the time. And many of them wanted to go to war. But Washington, once again, wants to avoid war. So what he's going to do is he's going to send a guy named John Jay. Now remember, he's one of the guys who helped write the Federalist Papers. And at the time, at this point in history now, he is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Washington sends him to England to negotiate a treaty. And he comes back with what's called Jay's Treaty, because we're not really creative with naming things. Now, what he's going to get out of this is he's going to get the British to abandon their policy of interference with our foreign trade. And they're also going to abandon their forts on the frontier. At least that's what they said. They didn't actually do either. And both of these are going to be future issues that we're going to deal with in a little thing called the War of 1812. But we'll talk about that in the next unit. But at least for now, we feel like we've gotten out of the way, even though we hadn't. Now, out in California, Jay's Treaty was seen as a threat by the Spanish. The Spanish saw this as a threat to their system out west, and that Americans would be continuing to come west now that the British looked like they were going to be getting out of the way, and they were going to be abandoning some of those forts. And they saw this kind of wave of Americans spilling across the Appalachians onto the Great Plains and eventually to their successful settlements in the southeast United States. So to counteract this, the Spanish will do a few things to try and shore up their hold on North America. So they increase their mission system in California, increase the number of them that they have out there, and they try to attempt to negotiate their border with the United States. And so this is going to lead to a few things as a result of this mission system. Not only will soldiers out there get the ability to have more social mobility, but we also see new cultural blending in California as more Spanish move out there, live out there, and intermarry with Native Americans that are already there. Now, the Spanish, in an attempt to try and settle things with the United States, is going to negotiate what's called Pinckney's Treaty. Now, Pinckney's Treaty attempts to set some borders with the United States. And what they do is they are able to negotiate the border with Florida at 31 degrees north latitude. And this guarantees also the access of American farmers to the port of New Orleans. Now, this is really significant because what this does is this helps Western farmers because it allows them to sell their products much more easily. And it also increases the migration west because now it's easier to make money living out west. People are more likely to move out that way. And we see as a result of Pinckney's Treaty, just more and more people spilling across the Appalachians, looking for those economic opportunities that are in the west with cheap land and the ability to now sell your products to distant markets. This now leads us then, though, to key idea number 6. With all those people moving west, we had an ambiguous relationship between the federal government and American Indian tribes. And this contributed to problems regarding treaties and American Indian legal claims relating to the seizure of their lands. Now, this is not Trail of Tears yet. So we're not talking about the Cherokee just quite yet. But what we just learned is that we've got tons and tons of people that are moving westward. In particular, we've got settlers are rushing not only to Georgia in the south, but also to Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, western New York. And they're moving on to tribal lands. And so what we see is we see conflict with Native Americans over land. And that conflict, especially in Ohio, is going to lead to a war. That war happens between an Ohio Indian alliance that's led by a group of Native Americans called the Shawnee against the United States government. Now, this war leads to probably the turning point battle called the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which happens in 1794, where the Native Americans are defeated. And this then leads into what's called the Treaty of Greenville. And the Treaty of Greenville is this kind of treaty that helps to set a precedent for how the federal government will deal with Native Americans and their land. The Indians will cede their lands in Ohio. That means that they're going to give up their lands in Ohio. And what the U.S. is going to do is it's going to promise to deal with them fairly in the future and recognize treaties and land holdings that they would have. However, this is going to be just one in a series of instances where the federal government will promise the Native Americans one thing, but then just not fulfill it and continue to let settlers move onto their lands, which will then cause war and conflict with Native Americans, and then have the federal government step in on the side of the settlers, take away more land from Native Americans, move them off their land, sign a new treaty promising that they'll respect those lands, and that process just continues over and over and over and over again. Which leads us finally then into key idea 7. George Washington's farewell address encouraged national unity as he cautioned against political factions and warned about the danger of permanent foreign alliances. So by 1796, Washington had chosen not to run for a third term as president. And he was afraid of a few things. One, he was afraid that if he died in office, it would create his final precedent that presidents can serve for life. He did not want to do that. He did not want to set that precedent. He had spent his entire political career, two-term president, setting precedents, and he did not want this to be one of them. There was no term limit in the Constitution. He could have served for as long as he wanted to, but by retiring intentionally after 2 terms, he set probably his most, or one of his most important precedents of retiring after 2. Now, it is now law. It's now in the Constitution, thanks to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected 4 times, but up until that rule was passed after Roosevelt's time, just only 50 years ago. We spent almost 170 years, 160 years with only 2 terms as the tradition, not the rule. However, before he left, Washington is going to give advice to the nation in what's called the farewell address. And it's probably one of his most important documents that he left for us. And he warned us of a few things. Number 1, he warned against the growth of factions and political parties, basically groups of people that would tear our nation apart. He, in many ways, foresaw what we're dealing with now, with different groups of people that are at each other's throats and not really getting along in the spirit of harmony. In addition to that, he also warned against the growing sectional tensions between North and South, specifically over the issue of slavery. Ironically, because he was also a slaveholder and he understood how difficult that situation was. He had tried to get rid of his slaves, to try and free them, but he couldn't do it financially without ruining himself. And he saw this as a major problem for slaveholders and for the nation. Finally, he also restated his desire for neutrality and warned against our entangling alliances, especially with European powers. He saw the United States, at least for the time being, as too weak to be able to get involved in a war dealing with European powers. Advice we would continue to follow all the way until World War I and World War II. Well, that ends our lecture today for George Washington and the precedents that he set while in office. Next time, we'll talk about culture and the presidency of John Adams. Until then, go Pack.